From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Coming up today, K-State's Vipan Kumar will address you crop producers on herbicide selection for pre-emergence control of kochia, something that needs to take place right away, he says. He'll go over the recommended two-pronged approach to effective kochia control. Then back over from the IGP Institute here at K-State, Guy Allen with his monthly status report on international grain trade and U.S. grain export opportunities. He'll center this time on the political unrest tied to the Russia-Ukraine situation, what those developments mean to U.S. grain business abroad. And on this week's edition of Milk Lines, K-State's Mike Brouk on preparing dairy facilities now for the summer heat to come. All that here on this Agriculture Today. You're tuned to Agriculture Today. Welcome once more to our Tuesday edition. Well, we're thinking crop weed control on this segment, and for you producers who have contended with kochia, it's not too early to start working in the direction of your control program. Our guest now is from K-State's Agricultural Research Center at Hayes. He's a weed scientist there, Vipan Kumar. And we're going to get into Vipan pre-plant herbicide applications for kochia control. A perpetually important topic because kochia has become such a headache for crop producers over the recent years, has it not?
Yes, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Sure.
And yes, you rightly said it's not too early to think about kochia control plans. And as you mentioned, kochia or herbicide-resistant kochia has become a real challenge for producers across the High Plains region, especially western Kansas. Resistance, when we talk about resistance, it's not only resistance to glyphosate, but resistance to other chemistries as well. Some of the work been recently published suggests that glyphosate-resistant kochia has been widespread in the Great Plains region, including western Kansas. Resistance to group 2 is also quite widespread in the region. And then there are a few biotypes or population have been reported with the resistance to atrazine as well as dicamba resistance. Mm-hmm. So multiple herbicide resistance is kind of, increasing concern for producers in the region. That's where it becomes very important to be proactive in terms of managing these resistant populations on the fields. And this is the right time to think about those proactive strategies because kochia is one of those early emerging species in the plains. And, the weather is nice, and if you have moisture, I think we will start seeing kochia pretty soon on the ground, poking up. So this is the time.
Because of the resistance issues, it takes strategy to put a dent in kochia, even as we think about early treatments here, pre-plant applications. In a recent Agronomy E-Update newsletter article that you co-authored, you brought out that a producer needs to employ two components to this control program. How so?
Yes, it is very, very crucial to understand when we are managing herbicide-resistant kochia and we are planning our strategies for our upcoming crops, we need to think about, including pre-emerge applied herbicide in our systems that can help providing residual activity for those kochia flushes in the season. And as you mentioned, two factors we have outlined in our e-update is a herbicide we need that is soluble and doesn't need too much moisture to activate. Things like dicamba can be very effective even in dry conditions. And another component or another mixture with that chemistry, we need a herbicide that has longer residual activity, herbicide like atrazine as an example. So both of them together can fit well in a situation like when we are thinking to spray our fields and we have started seeing some emergence in the field. So dicamba will take care of those emerging seedlings, and atrazine, for example, will help controlling those kochia flushes in the season.
And so it's a two-step approach here, but you stress that those initial treatments have to go on prior to kochia emergence.
Yes, it is better to apply these herbicide application as early as possible, and more importantly, prior to kochia start emerging. As I said, this is the time for kochias to come. This is the right window to go with herbicide application or pre-herbicide application. When I was talking regarding herbicide resistance, so all these resistance cases are mostly to the post-application of those herbicides, things like glyphosate or ALS inhibitors or even foliar-applied dicamba resistance. We have several pre-applied herbicide chemistries which are still pretty effective, and we should integrate those in our system rather relying only on burn down or post-herbicide applications.
So when you think about those alternatives, and of course these are covered in the Chemical Weed Control Guide out of K-State, the annual publication, what tank mixes come to the surface as good candidates for these early treatments, Vipan?
Yes, that's a very good question. You have to be very selective in using these pre-herbicides depending on what crop you're going to plant, because some chemistries are specifically labeled for those specific crops. For example, if you're planning for a crop like soybean, you can go with, pre-herbicides, things like group 14, group 15 herbicides, like sulfentrazone is a good option there. Pyroxasulfone is a good option there. And there are several premixes available, like pyroxasulfone with metribuzin, pyroxasulfone with sulfentrazone. Those are good combo, pretty effective on kochia as a residual combo for kochia in soybean. For other crops like corn, group 27 or HPPD inhibitors could be a good option. Like things like balanced flax or corvus is a good options to go with. And then along with those, you also need to think about what you can spray later in the season as a post-application. And when you talk about corn, you have things like status, which is dicamba, can be effective when you have a good pre-program in front. So, yeah, there are options in these crops. And if you are thinking to leave the ground as a fallow and coming as a winter wheat in the fall, there are options as well. Things like you can spray like metribuzin or, flumioxazine. Those are good combinations to go with, as well as you can also rely on some dicamba will also provide some residual activity for those scenarios as well. So there are options. And similarly, for crops like sunflower, we have Authority Supreme, a new premix, which is basically a pyroxasulfone and sulfentrazone, is very, very effective on kochia in terms of residual control. So there are options, quite a few options, and there are more options outlined in the Weed Control Guide, as you mentioned.
That reference is invaluable in determining what your plan will be. That's the point, though, to map out your strategy against this weed. And if one goes about this the right way, what is the general expected level of control? Can one put a sizable dent in that weed?
Yes, it does. As per my experience with kochia and working with the pre-herbicides or residual herbicides, pretty good activity from those chemistries I just mentioned, things like sulfentrazone or pyroxasulfone or flumioxazine. They are pretty good residual activity. And if you go with some dicamba also provides a residual activity along with the foliar activity. And atrazine is our, main herbicides to go with for residual activity on these kochia and other pigweed species. But one thing I would like to emphasize here that we need to also avoid relying too much on a single or same mode of actions year after year. We have seen in literature that kochia is such a species that can adapt to that strategies pretty well. For example, if you keep spraying isoxaflutol or balanced flax or corvus treatment every year for corn, the kochia start adapting to those kind of strategies, and shifts its emergence towards the later season. So it escaped those pre-herbicide applications of balanced flax or Corvus. So that has been reported. It's published work. So we need to diversify our pre-herbicide program, every other year so that the species do not adapt to those strategies.
Good herbicide stewardship always has value here.
Yes, it is.
And we would invite folks to not only check out the chemical weed control guide for the options available to them for pre-plant treatments, but there's this article in the Agronomy E-Update newsletter posted this past Thursday on pre-plant herbicide applications for kochia control, which shares this information and more. We direct you producers toward that. But in closing, Vipan, it's something producers need to be on top of fairly soon now.
Yes, I guess the main, message I would like to give that you have to be very, very proactive, especially considering kochia developing resistance to post-herbicides. We don't have many, cheaper and effective post options, but there are quite a few pre-herbicides available that we can use and bring into our systems for kochia control, as well as herbicide-resistant kochia management.
Well, thanks for the overview here on something that's important to producers who have been battling this weed for some time, getting on top of it as early as possible. We appreciate it, Vipan, and we'll talk again later.
Thanks, Eric.
He's a weed scientist for K-State based at the university's Agricultural Research Center at Hayes. That's Vipan Kumar. Again, on pre-plant herbicide treatments for dealing with kochia problems on crop ground. You're listening to Agriculture Today. We're back now on this Agriculture Today, and every month we like to bring your way an update on what's developing on the international grain trade front, and to say the least, plenty in recent days. And we'll cover several things with Guy Allen joining us once again. Guy, as you know, is the senior economist with the IGP Institute here at Kansas State University. The first thing we want to do before we talk geopolitical matters, Guy, is quickly glance back at last week's USDA Grain Supply and Demand Report, formerly known as the World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates Report. And this is a good barometer monthly of what's happening with international grain sales. Rather uneventful by and large, you say.
Yeah, look, everything pretty much came in as expected. Not too many changes there. I think the USDA is probably waiting for some confirmation on the March 31st stocks report. That's always a good indicator, or is the tank half empty or half full? And in a season like we're having with tight stocks and tight inventory, you're watching that gas tank pretty close to see exactly where we're at till we're come up to the next fuel station this coming harvest. But I guess the one thing I think is important to highlight is they continue to whittle away the South American production on dry weather. We saw the USDA drop Brazilian soybean production by 5 million tons to 134 million metric tons. Also, I think a key number for soybeans is Paraguay, not an exceptionally large producer, but an important exporter. They dropped their production by 26%. Their production was down to 6.3 million metric tons. That's off 36% from last year. And last year wasn't one of their best years. If you recall, dry weather there. And one of the biggest impacts on that dry weather is the shutting down of the Parana River, which is an important supply chain avenue, not only for Paraguay, but Uruguay, Argentina, and southern Brazil beans move out of that particular channel. Then the day after, on Thursday morning last week, we saw the Brazilian government agency, CONAB, then come out with some numbers, and that's what really rocked that market. They came out with a very, very tight number. They sliced that Brazilian soybean crop estimate to 125.5 million metric tons. That was down from its previous estimate of 140 million metric tons. And that just really ran a surprise in the marketplace. That's why we saw that big rally, particularly in soybeans on Thursday. And that followed through then to Friday's events.
There are still questions aligned with that as well. If we look at corn and the likelihood of a second crop of corn in South America, the dryness once again is prevailing there.
Yeah, that second crop, safrinha corn crop, is real important. They're planting that crop right now as we speak, and that dry weather will have a big impact on that as well. And whether it's corn or beans, or even to a slightly lesser extent, wheat, any little hiccup in production is going to have a significant impact on price. And I think we saw a reflection of that in the more bullish direction than what we've seen in sort of the downward direction we've seen when we started the year.
By and large, before we move on to other things beyond the WASDE report, the markets are likely to monitor South American conditions closely for the next several weeks until we get to something, for instance, like the planting intentions report in late March out of the USDA.
Yeah, well, look, we'll be watching that South American report all the way through. Like I said, the second crop of safrinha corn is just being planted, so it'll be another 90 to 120 days. We'll be watching that real close. The first planting crop's under its way, but stressing a bit. And the soybean situation, we'll be watching that through all the way through March. And any change in that weather forecast in South America is gonna move that market direction pretty quick.
Well, Guy, perhaps even more front and center now, and we want to spend the bulk of our remaining time on this, geopolitical matters and more directly what's happening surrounding Russia. And we'll start with this. Russia-China relations seem to be tightening, and that could definitely have repercussions on our international grain trade capabilities to China in particular, could it not?
Yeah, most definitely. We saw the Olympics commence with the opening ceremonies a week ago from last Friday. Vladimir Putin attended those, and during that time, he took the opportunity to meet with President Xi Jinping. And I think it had been 2 years since they had met. A couple important issues came out, one in the energy sector and the grain, wheat, and barley and oilseed sector, is they agreed to loosen up their trade restrictions and actually develop a more tight trading relationship. That fits into Russia's situation in trying to secure their exports and generate hard currency, as well as China's capacity to secure a diversified food supply chain. Now, Russia particularly, they can execute those shipments into China via rail system, which has been much improved in the back of China's Belt and Roads Initiative to develop those supply chains. And this comes on the eve of what we're seeing as a potential invasion by Russia into the Ukraine. Now, on Friday about noon, there was some rumors going around that just really spiked the markets on that. About noon, there was a press conference by the military, U.S. military. It was sort of misinterpreted a bit, I guess, or misstated that Russian invasion was imminent. I think they meant that probably in the next few days, probably before even the Olympics had finished. And that really spiked these markets. We saw not only soybeans and wheat and a number of commodities rally, but we saw West Texas crude rally just under $95 a barrel. But I think just, rumors and speculation like that, the way it can really move these markets is a good indicator of just how delicate and sensitive these markets are to new information coming in. And we're watching that arena at the moment just very closely.
The dramatic developments that may occur there, well, they will have repercussions clearly on all markets, and the commodity market's not accepted. This matter of China turning to Russia for more of its grain purchases, though, how does that directly impact and, in fact, affect negatively U.S. grain trade to China?
Over the last year or two, China has emerged as an increasing buyer of U.S. wheat. And I think if they turn to Russia to secure that, that's not going to help our wheat markets. Our wheat markets have been kind of sluggish so far this year anyways, and our exports are running behind. I think that's a reflection, as we've talked previously, on the levels of ocean freight. but as well as readily available supplies from other originations, not only Russia, but Australia and the EU as well. But I think just the freight spreads and those supply chains. But I think that discussion between Russia and China was probably more of a long-term arrangement, and dropping some of the phytosanitary and other trade tariff issues that they had in place to just make that a little easier. One question that comes in Russia is, if they do have a military invasion, is that going to disrupt the supply chain? There's sort of two schools of thought. Kiev is in the north of the country. The export terminals are in the southern part of the country. Now, a lot of grain flows from the north to the south to those ports for export. Will there be much disruption? Some people suggest that the disruption is probably not to be as great or as significant as what they might think, particularly if we follow the school of thought. The idea is that I don't think Putin necessarily wants to make Kiev a part of Russia. I think he wants to go in there and establish control, but doesn't necessarily want ownership. And that's not too dissimilar from the approach that he's taken in Georgia. I think that was in 2014, as well as probably more recently in Kazakhstan, just in the past few weeks in that move. And I think they want to keep that domestic disruption probably to a minimum, because there's actually quite a bit of wheat and other grains that flows from Russia to those southern ports in the Ukraine on the Black Sea.
This is clearly, though, Guy, a fluid situation, and the markets are going to be jumpy. There's just no two ways about it.
Yeah, it's quite fluid, quite dynamic, and look, there's some risk premium built into that market already. You know, I think if he would back off and withdraw the troops, I think the markets would collapse a bit. Conversely, if he continues to move forward, as we saw on Friday's move, there's significant upside potential there as well.
Yeah. It's interesting, if nothing else, to monitor what's going on there. And Guy, once again, regularly posts updates on the international grain trades and what's happening, and those can be found on agmanager.info. Good reads, producers and others interested in the grain markets, agmanager.info. Well, Guy, a pleasure again, and we'll talk with you here in a month and see what the next USDA report has to say and whatever else may be happening of influence in our international grain trades. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Eric, and until then, hope everybody has profitable trading.
Indeed. Guy Allen is the senior economist with the IGP Institute here at K-State. Each month he offers up his latest thoughts on the status of international grain trade, and specifically how well U.S. grain export interests are positioned there. After this next break, our weekly segment for you dairy producers from K-State's Mike Brouk. You're listening to Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today, and time to hear once again from K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk. He's along here each week with another edition of Milk Lines, and he tells us this week that there's legitimate anticipation of higher milk prices this summer, and he thinks that you producers can be positioning your milk output for that accordingly by taking steps now to outfit your facilities for the hotter weather to come. Mike, fill us in.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning being ready to take advantage of what might be some increased milk prices this summer. One of the things I'd encourage you to do as you look over your dairy records is look to see the number of animals that you're going to be freshening from June, July, August, and even into September. You know, most of your breeding records are probably up to date, so you got a pretty good idea of how many animals are actually going to freshen during that time. So let's think about something else. We know from research, and there's been many studies done, and it's very clear that if we cool our dry cows and pre-fresh cows correctly, we can gain anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 pounds of milk on the lactation. So, thinking about the number of cows that you have to freshen during that period and the ones that you will need to be cooling during that period, how much milk could you potentially increase in your production of your herd if you actually cooled those dry cows and pre-fresh cows. You might want to think about what milk price might look like in the summer as well. Based on predictions, we could be well above $20 a hundredweight. So there is some income on the table here that you might be able to take advantage of. So let's talk about what you should be looking at in terms of cooling dry cows as well as the pre-fresh cows. Techniques are much the same as what they are with the lactating cows. So if you have freeze stalls in the dry cow area, fans over the freeze stalls. If you have a feed line, water soaking system over the feed line is what we would probably recommend, along with some supplemental airflow in that area as well. How about your transition cows? Well, this becomes a bit more difficult because a lot of times we have those pre-fresh cows on some sort of bedded pack. Soaker lines at the feed line could be used, but maybe not as effective in these animals. We could put fans over that bedded pack, but we know without being able to cool the air, we could have an issue with the effectiveness of just a fan blowing hot air over cows that might already be hot. So the incorporation of some sort of evaporative cooling, whether it be cool cells or whether it be some sort of high-pressure mist system, might be the choice so that we can cool the air that we're blowing on the cows. Again, I think this is an opportunity for us, but we got to think ahead this year. And the reason we have to think ahead is because of issues in the supply chain. You know, many of the fans that we might use or other components to these cooling systems are not manufactured, or major parts of them are not manufactured here in the United States. So allowing adequate time to make sure that we would have fans on our farm in time to have them put up and operating before summer heat stress starts is very important. So if you're considering doing something for your transition cows and your dry cows this summer in terms of cow cooling, I would encourage you to begin the process of planning and getting the supplies ordered that you needed so that you might be able to put them up before we actually get to the time when animals are starting to be stressed. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike, as always. Well, on tomorrow's broadcast, we'll have a visit with K-State's Dorvart Ruiz-Diaz and Jenny Ift. They're involved in a test run of a new crop insurance endorsement policy. This is a pilot project being conducted in northeast Kansas. That policy pays out when producers are prevented from applying nitrogen on dryland corn post-planting. Jenny and Dorvar will tell us more about it. Also tomorrow, our next conversation with Roger McOwen of the Washburn University School of Law. Please be back with us tomorrow for all that and more. Meantime, Eric Atkinson here bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.